Okay.
Hi Mark. It's great to be here today. I'm Fiona Whyte and we're going to have a conversation about ESG. Now I know some of your listeners might be doing a bit of an eye roll and it can be a bit of a polarising issue for some people these days, but stay tuned. I've got experience from two sides of the equation, from some of my work involved here at the FMA and then also sitting on a board in Cambodia.
Hi, I'm Mark Banicevich. Welcome to Governance Bites. Today I'm very privileged and happy to spend some more time with my friend Fiona Whyte. Fiona, thank you very much again for your time.
Thanks, Mark.
Fiona's got a long background in banking through foreign exchange and things in particular in commercial banking, and also she's been with the Financial Markets Authority in New Zealand for over a decade now, and has also been for that period on a number of boards, particularly in Cambodia, through World Vision, and now on a commercial bank in Cambodia with a significant amount of lending on the book.
Yes.
So thank you very much for your time. And today we're going to talk about environmental, social and governance factors, which has become a bit of a buzzword over the last few years. Can I start with the question, what is ESG?
Yeah, that is a great question. And many people will be familiar with the environmental, social, governance aspect to it. If we kind of take a step back and up, it's part of the continuum of that broader responsible investment, sustainable investment, ethical investment. It's kind of maybe in the middle between absolutely no consideration whatsoever and pure profit, just focusing on traditional financial and physical capital, through to the other end of the spectrum, which is pure philanthropy. So ESG, according to the UNPRI, is talking about issues that relate to environment being the quality and the functioning of natural environment and systems. And then for social, it's about the rights and well-being of interests and people and their communities. And then governance, which is what we're here to talk about today, is governance of companies, but also any kind of organisation, whether it's not-for-profit or charity or some sort of incorporated society, something like that. So I actually prefer to think of it more along the lines of the continuum with natural, social and human capitals. And for me, it's about understanding the organisation, its supply chain or its value chain, where the value is and what are the inputs going into the organisation, how that impacts the operation that you're providing the service and the products for, and then the organisation itself, how they use their resources to provide their products and services. If you wrap that up, it's actually kind of like a double materiality concept, which is quite popular in Europe. But in the New Zealand context and in some of the Western contexts, it's just single materiality, where we're just focusing on the inputs that come into the organisation.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that double materiality concept?
It's thinking about not only what comes into the organisation, all of the inputs, not just the widgets and the electricity and the labour and all of the components that go into, we're talking financial services, so it might be the capital that comes in, it could be the branch buildings, the office supplies, it could be clothing, vehicles, uniforms, whatever, any of the inputs that you need to run your operation, and then how you as a company operate, and then how you manage your natural resources, how you manage your staff, your social resources, your social license to operate, things like that, and then the outputs, the impacts on your stakeholders and your customers and that kind of thing. So it's kind of thinking about it in a big bubble, really.
How do we fit into that value chain, as you suggested, that value system of inputs through what we do in our business and the outputs at the other end?
Yep.
Right. And this rise in environmental, social and governance activity is, to a large extent, it feels like it's being driven from consumers, right? We're demanding this a bit more. And we're seeing a lot more of pension funds, KiwiSaver funds, being selective about what they invest in on the basis of these factors, because consumers are starting to demand this. The Gen Ys, Gen Zs, Gen Alphas are pretty careful about what they do. And there was a recent webinar from the Financial Services Council around modern slavery and this whole concept of how the stationery that you buy, the people that are making that, are they looked after, or is this Yes.
It's all encompassing, and New Zealand doesn't have a modern slavery law yet, right? There's been some petitions, some of the NGOs here presented petitions to Parliament under the former government. There was some work being considered. I'm not sure exactly where it sits in the current program. Australia has a modern slavery law, so any organisations that are operating here and in Australia, their Australian parents will be looking at it.
Right.
I mean, but modern slavery and trafficking can filter into your supply chain, sometimes without you even really knowing it, and you know, like in a really random, weird sort of context. You know, we're all having issues with scammers and getting proliferation of, you know, whether it's a text message or email or phone calls or whatever, and you know, spending a lot of time trying to educate people to stop, pause, and reflect. The sad fact is, the scammers themselves, a lot of them are trafficked.
Right. Yes.
So
Yeah,
that's in a, you know, that's in a really
sign,
nefarious sort of situation. But yeah, it's I guess having those audits, having the questions, asking, you know, trying to understand your supply chain and where those inputs will come from.
And scamming is a nice analogous example, because if you can remove the demand for the product, then you reduce the market for the slavery. That's kind of where a lot of this is coming from, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we all avoid the scams, then hopefully these scam businesses will stop making the money, and it won't be viable to do so. One of the challenges, I think, we've got a huge, as I think many countries have, a huge portion of our businesses in New Zealand are very small. Yeah. And having, you know, if you've got a business of 5 or 10 people, how do you then evaluate the inputs that you use and ensure that they're meeting these requirements? It can be a lot of work involved in that, and I wonder whether we'll get to the stage of having some sort of reporting. So you go down to warehouse stationery and you buy a bunch of stationery, you need some confidence that the things that you're buying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think to your point about consumer demand, consumer demand is driving disclosure, right? And so people want to know what it is that they're buying, what's on the label, whether it's a financial product or if it's, you know, like box of cereal or something like that. You know, what are the inputs going into that? And you know, like that consumer demand, I did some papers back in 2007, you know, and that was one of the last papers I did, was talking about empowered consumer demand.
Right.
That's nearly 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So ESG might feel like a recent buzzword over the last 5 years or so, but it's certainly been around a lot longer.
It's been a growing swell, hasn't it?
It has. It has.
Why then? We've probably covered this to some extent, but I'll get an answer from you specifically on this. Why is ESG important? Yeah.
So again, the UN PRI say that it's actually incorporating these ESG factors, they call them environment, social, government. I like to think of it natural, social, human capitals.
Yes.
Into an investment process. It's just that the belief that these factors, if they're not being managed, we talked a bit earlier about risks, they are risks that need to be managed and considered. Some might be able to be mitigated, some may not. You know, then that assessment around what degree of risk does it pose to our organisation. Actually, for us, it's only a really small risk. It's okay, we can absorb that, or we can do something different. Or others might go, look, that risk is too high and too great. We have to actually find another substitute or do something completely different. So it does affect the risk and the return of the investment, or I guess the ultimate result of the business. And then, if we're looking at it in a pricing on a NZX listed company or something like that, that sometimes these factors are not fully priced into the actual asset price of the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
So they are important, even though people are thinking, oh yeah, what does it really matter? Actually, I think, and like for the Te Ao Māori worldview, right, and in New Zealand we've got such a beautiful relationship and growing, and there's a lot that we can learn, but their model is more, and their worldview is more around people and planet and then profit. And I feel like, okay, if we ESG, it's more
We're
around
catching up, aren't we?
Slowly. I think the Māori will be saying, come on, get with the program.
And Indigenous governance, I think not just Māori, I understand from a lot of parts of the world, there's this real intergenerational view. This
long-term view. It's not a 6-month reporting thing and I need to make sure that I've got this amount of return for shareholders, which, you know, is important equally, but it's also saying, well, and that's kind of the key of governance and looking at the organisation, what we're doing now, is that going to mean that we have a sustainable organisation that will be here in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time?
Yes.
And especially with climate risk and climate change, that's a really systemic issue that some people are considering, some are not, some are now for the first time this year having to disclose their climate statements.
Yes.
So that's a really new thing for New Zealand organisations.
It feels like it's coming from this growing groundswell, which is awareness and disclosure and this circularity that's evolved, getting bigger and bigger, and leading to this consumer level demand that we want these things from businesses. And if you're a business that isn't living up to ESG standards or corporate social responsibility, then at some point the market's going to say, we don't want you anymore.
Yeah.
And it's about remaining relevant. On that basis, moving into the boardroom now, why then is ESG relevant in the boardroom? How is it relevant in the boardroom?
I think just following on from my last comment, it's about the sustainability of the organisation itself. Are we in business for 5 minutes, 5 years, 50 years? Do you want to be here in 100 years? And, the benefit of our Korean friends and the bank I'm involved in, they've been around since 1889.
Wow.
So there is longevity in that space. But that heart of governance is having that lens to make sure we're not just in it for the quick buck today. We want to make sure that what we're doing is growing a sustainable organisation, that it will be there in the future. It's that fiduciary duty, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point, I think it feels to me, and I want to learn more about this in terms of Indigenous governance, that whole long-term view, as you implied then, is also very common in the East. Yeah. And we in the West have this kind of short-term view, largely I think based on incentives given to senior management, that's it's all about the next 3 years, it's all about the next 5 years, kind of at most in many cases. There might be a 10-year strategy, but it's all about the next bonus. And how do we change that mentality to that real long-term view, which is the sustainability of this business, which will bring in these concepts. How then does an effective board oversee its ESG behaviours? Yeah,
I think bringing it into the boardroom through your risk papers, right? And then you mentioned about incentives. If you're being really bold, tie your CEOs to some kind of metric around what's right for your organisation that starts to build in some of these wider factors, whether it's climate change, whether it's social factors, whether it's modern slavery. It depends on what the underlying business is. But all of these issues are risks that the organisation may face, right? And it's not sitting there pontificating and going, oh, what if, these things may or may not happen, but, what's real for your organisation? And how does climate change affect your organisation? Many businesses in New Zealand will be thinking about it right now, and so certainly the larger businesses in New Zealand, it's just under 200 of them that are starting to file climate statements. But that will trickle down to, maybe the banks here are going to start asking the customers that they lend to and say, well, tell us about your emissions, tell us about what your supply chain looks like, where are your risks involved?
So a smart board would be preparing for that now, knowing that it's coming.
Yeah.
I like the tie to those, understanding what the risks are, and I think you've also implied there, bringing it back to the KPIs for your chief executive and your senior management. And although their incentives may be short term, maybe 1 year, 6 month kind of, probably 1 year kind of incentives, the KPIs that you measure can be longer view. So you might incentivize them based on their 12-month delivery against a metric that impacts 20 years and 30 years down the track. Right.
Yeah. What am I doing today that's going to help tomorrow?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What activities does a board do to assess and manage its ESG-related risks?
Yeah, I think it's definitely in the risk committees, like bringing it in as a standing agenda item. What's changing, It's a journey for all of us, right? And so you kind of got to start where your organisation is at. And so some might be completely starting from zero and not really considered it at all. That's okay. We all have to start somewhere. So just starting to acknowledge that while you're factoring in your external and internal risks into your heat maps and your risk matrix and things like that, start thinking about, what's the size of my workforce? How am I impacting my community? Do I have social license to operate? How valuable is that to me? Is it quite sensitive? Is it something that I could lose overnight and that's going to have a real material difference? I think that the real complexity with ESG is that sometimes everything's not in harmony. It might be that there's a risk that you're looking at from an environmental perspective or a social perspective, and they can clash.
Yes, right.
So you do have to look at it for your own organisation and go, what's the proportionality of that risk, and what is the likelihood or the impact of that if that was to eventuate? How would that play out, and what's happening around me? I think 18 months ago Aucklanders wouldn't have been thinking about flood risk at all, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a lot of New Zealanders, well, probably 100,000 New Zealanders having to have insurance claims over last year, have suddenly realised what the impact is. Now, some people have climate resilient. They've taken measures to make their properties climate resilient. Others have ignored it and said, it was one in a 100-year event. And you can kind of bring that thinking into the boardroom too, where you go, okay, maybe my business is affected. It was a 1 in 100-year event. I don't have to think about it anymore. Or you could be going, yikes, my building's in a low-lying area. I can maybe change, or maybe I need to relocate, or what are the other things that I need to be doing so that if there were similar situations to occur again, then I'm not actually going to be affected to the same degree.
And I think we've had a few of those 1 in 100-year events happen in the last. We had the pandemic. 5 years, we've had the earthquakes in Christchurch and Kaikoura. I think it behoves all directors now to think about those 1 in 100 years events and say, actually, it could happen. And what are the other things then that are similar to this that could happen? How would we react to those? And I wonder whether a good starting point for every director would be just to read about ESG, understand a little bit about what environmental, social and governance factors we're talking about. And climate is one, human trafficking is another, and modern slavery. And how does that impact your business? And actually think, well, yeah, it does. This is not something that's happening on the other side of the world that's not relevant to us. So reading broadly about what those factors are, bringing them into the boardroom, doing a self-discovery, thinking yourself about what could go wrong here, and then transferring that into your risk committee and making sure that it's considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's plenty of resources out there. I think that's the challenge too, right? There is a bit of an information overload, or people might not know where to start. But if you're a member of the Institute of Directors, they've got Chapter 0 who's focusing purely on climate-related risks. So it's a great place to kind of engage in some great resources. There's lots of podcasts around. There's like Standard & Poor's do an ESG Insider podcast. So that's a nice, easy listening, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and you can pop that in the car if you're commuting or when you're out for a walk. So don't be afraid, just dip your toe in and start the journey. Yeah,
absolutely. And when you Google, it's about looking at who comes up, not just what comes up, right? Things that come up from the IMF or those World Bank, those sorts of organisations could be a good starting point as well. The Institute of Directors, those sorts of entities.
The UN, plenty. UN SDGs, kind of looking at how do they affect the environment. That can also be a good starting framework, right?
Yeah, they do some amazing reports. Change of tack.
Okay.
What's the best advice you've received as a director?
I think it kind of alludes to some of the questions that we talked about in our former session around how active and engaged you are. Are you reading all the papers? I guess you can really tell when directors show up and they're asking questions where the information's in the paper, and you feel for management. There's a lot of time and energy by management invested in preparing the information for the board. So, let's not waste their time and energy. You need to get the relevant information in the papers and then read them, think about the questions. If you're not sure about something, just ask. And if you're really not sure, ask the chair beforehand. Like if there's an issue that you might feel like you're going to vote no, because we don't have to vote yes all the time. There's no groupthink going on. So if there's something that you're going, this just doesn't resonate for me, for this organisation, for this period of time, have a chat with the chair beforehand if you're not comfortable just, throwing a bombshell in the actual boardroom. So just remember that you can engage with the chair, and to kind of develop that relationship as well. So read the papers, ask the questions, don't be afraid to vote no, and engage with your chair. Yeah,
great. So prepare. Prepare for your meetings. And ask the questions. That's great. And do have some pre-conversations, particularly if you're in a position where you disagree with something. Don't be afraid to vote no. That's some awesome advice, Fiona. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Another great conversation.
Yeah, I look forward to doing it again soon.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for joining us. Hopefully see you next episode.
Okay.
Thank you for watching this episode of Governance Bites. We have more episodes on YouTube and your favourite podcast channel, where I interview directors and experts on various topics relating to boards of directors and governance. We'd love to see you back, and please like, subscribe and share the videos and podcasts.